Governor George Allen is a self-described common-sense Jeffersonian conservative. And that's not just a title he made up. He actually first ran for office and took his seat in the General Assembly in the same district that Thomas Jefferson actually hailed from. He's a fellow history major graduate of the University of Virginia, but his political career is perhaps best known to all of you. He's been involved in public life since early 90s at least, and has served as both in the State General Assembly in both houses of Congress and as governor. He was sworn in as the 67th governor, somewhere around there, in 1994, and really made national headlines for the economic development, public safety, education, accountability, and welfare reform initiatives that he spurred. It was also at that point, as a personal note, that we first got to know what a friend of the Jewish community Governor Allen was. And I can tell you from personal experience, having been nominated by him to serve on the Virginia Israel Advisory Board, what a keen interest he took in our community, and particularly in the welfare of the State of Israel. It was my privilege to travel with the governor to the land of Israel in 1996, I think it was, to worship at the Western Wall with him, to see what an effect that had, the struggles and travails of the land of Israel, the people of Israel. Of course, we found out later that there was more than just a emotional or intellectual attachment. Later on, we found out in his 2006 race for the Senate with Jim Webb that there were actual blood connections to our community, and they came out in a very interesting and emotional way. We found out that the governor had Jewish roots. We found out that his maternal grandfather was actually persecuted by the Nazis in French Tunisia. Many interesting things came out, and I think as a result of that, the connections to our community have just gotten closer and closer. Since that time, he's dedicated himself to public life further. He serves as a Reagan Ranch Presidential Scholar for the Young American Foundation. He's written a book, and most importantly for all of us right now, he is running for the United States Senate. So, without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce to you Governor George Allen.
Ladies and gentlemen, patriots all, good afternoon. It's good to be with all of you all here. I'm going to get this thing just right. Jeff, thank you so very much for the very kind introduction. I was saying you're taking some of what I wanted to say in my speech, which is fine, which means you're a good lawyer as well, and making sure the witness gets into the issues that we all care about. And there's also some personal things I want to share with you all too, and then look forward to the questions that Joel Rubin will be the referee on, supposedly. It's good to see Art Sandler here as well. It's perfect that this room, this auditorium, is because of his family's wonderful generosity. When I served in the United States Senate, most people know I'm pretty frugal. I hate waste. I always get the cheapest gas prices. I reuse folders from places I've been, and so forth. Art was really on foreign relations, particularly the Middle East and Egypt. Art was in my office a lot. We have all our staff together. We didn't have to pay him. It was perfect. We were able to turn back, actually, while I was governor, when I was senator, $1.4 million. And some of that is we worked very efficiently. And the other aspect is we just would get such great information and not have to have the staff doing it. Art would come in, and others with APAC, and were very helpful. And I was on the Foreign Relations Committee. And so there are a lot of initiatives and resolutions and efforts that needed to be made. And Art and others would come in our office and say, here's this, and have all the background. It wasn't just say, vote for this or vote against that or something. There'd be good information. So Art, thank you. You saved the taxpayers money by being, and I hope you are again. You're all you, and all Virginians are always welcome in our office, but you and AIPAC were truly a very important part of our campaign staff and our initiatives. It is great to be with the United Jewish Federations of Tidewater. Thank you for sponsoring this forum. It's good to see friends like Bruce Meyer and others who are here. This is a crucial time, folks. It's a crucial time in our world. It's a crucial time for America. It's a time for choosing. It's our generation's rendezvous with destiny, and I think this election in 2012 is as important as the election of 1980 when Governor Reagan defeated President Carter. And I think 2012 will determine the decisions that are made, particularly in Virginia, which is right in the center of the political battlegrounds. Virginia is going to decide who's in the majority of the U.S. Senate, whether it's myself or my friend Tim Kaine. That will decide whether leadership changes in the United States Senate. And most people think Virginia is going to decide who the next president of the United States is. And that's one of the reasons I got off the sidelines. Susan and I got off the sidelines and into the fight, because this is a time where the United States, I think, is vulnerable, and our friends and allies in Israel are also vulnerable. In fact, they've become even more vulnerable in the course of this campaign that generally takes, it's like a triathlon of the length of these campaigns. We're vulnerable to outside forces in our country due to, in my view, our counterproductive energy policies as well as our dangerous levels of debt. The landscape in the Middle East has become even more unstable. And it's a situation that Israel is now surrounded more than ever by countries that are not necessarily at all friendly to them. Obviously, Syria was not friendly to Israel prior to the civil war that's going on there now. Egypt did have a treaty and still does have a treaty, and they need to adhere to that treaty with Israel. But now you have the Muslim Brotherhood that has taken over in Egypt. And I think that more than ever, what we need to do is make sure the United States and Israel are standing together. There cannot be any daylight seen between the United States and Israel. Israel is an ally and is a friend. I look at Israel as a wellspring in the wilderness in the Middle East. It is a democratic and reliable friend. And you stand with your friends in times of need. The worst thing, I think, that ought to be done is show any division, any distance between us and Israel. That only emboldens Iran, which right now is very much emboldened. They actually think they're moving forward with their strategic efforts. They had that non-aligned nations meeting, and I have a friend who sends me the Friday prayers from Iran, from Tehran. They're translated, and it's important to read what they're saying and how various events are being stated as from these ayatollahs or these mullahs to the people. And they are very emboldened. And it seems like at least half of them are blasting Zionists, they're blasting the United States, they're blasting Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and others, and anybody who's trying to have sanctions on them as well. And it's important to see what their mindset is and what they're saying to the people of those countries. Now, throughout my public service, I have worked very hard to promote ties between Israel and the United States. When I was governor, as Jeff said, we started the Virginia-Israel Partnership, which was to increase ties between Israel and the United States, whether it's educational, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic development. And all of them have been very, very beneficial. And there's a lot of Israeli companies that have invested in our Commonwealth of Virginia and providing jobs to Virginians. Jeff alluded to this in the introduction. It was about 6 years ago in a month, I found out from my mother that I had Jewish heritage through my grandfather, Felix Lombroso. My middle name is Felix, which honors my grandfather. There was an assertion made that I was hiding our Portuguese Sephardic Jewish heritage. I learned how to say Sephardic. And I knew my mother was from Tunisia, knew my grandfather had been incarcerated by the Nazis during World War II. And I knew she was French and Italian, and she had told me there was a little bit of Spanish in it. So I figured that the Portuguese was going to be the Iberian Peninsula. I could add that to the various bloodlines in our family, in addition to the Scotch, Irish, and Dutch on my father's side. And then found that my mother, all these years, had been concealing that my grandfather was Jewish. And I asked her, why? This is interesting. Why did you do this? And she was trying to protect us. The fear of the Nazis that instilled in a young girl had her fearful that her babies wouldn't have opportunities, my father wouldn't get jobs. And she was shaking, she was in tears, she didn't want me to tell anyone. And there was a couple of weeks I couldn't tell anyone. I was just personally, I was thinking, when am I going to be able to reveal this? Because my mother said, I'm going to tell you something, but I can't. I'll tell you it only if you swear on Pup-Up's head. You don't tell anyone. And the Allen family, swearing on Pup-Up is what we called our grandfather. That is the highest pledge. And so I had to keep that pledge for 2 weeks, and it was really tormenting. And I was saying, when am I going to be released from this pledge to my mother, and at her funeral or something like that? And so finally, it was just great that I was able to reveal it in our children. Susan looks at this as a treasure box that has been opened up, and every time, and my mother, thank goodness, she's tough and she's still with us. But every time we're together, we get her to talk so that our children will learn from her experiences. Now, I bring all that up in this sense. One, as Jeff said, I had Mr. Jefferson's seat in the House of Delegates. And I've always believed in freedom of religion, freedom of expression, private ownership of property, the rule of law. And with this revelation, freedom of religion was no longer enlightened Jeffersonian principles. It was very personal. And what it's done is invigorated me to make sure that whenever bigotry, hatred, whether it's against somebody because of their religion or their race or their ethnicity, nationality, whatever that bigotry or hatred or prejudice rises up, it's important for leaders to condemn it. Otherwise, people will think that is acceptable behavior. The other thing is that it made me more sensitive to certain things that I probably never would have picked up before. Because there's never been any discrimination that I know of against myself. But when there is that discrimination, you're more sensitive to it. Because the person who had given you life lived so many years, 60 years, nearly 60 years with this fear of concealing the Jewish heritage in her family, in our family. The other is looking at history of the Middle East and history of the Mediterranean. And you see how many Jewish people once lived in Tunisia and Libya and Algeria and Egypt and Lebanon. And there were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jewish people that lived in those countries. The populations now of Jewish people in those countries is maybe a few hundred or a few thousand. That means, to me, that Israel, as a Jewish state, a safe and strong and thriving Jewish state, is more important than ever. Historically, it is essential that Jewish people have Israel as a state that is of their religion. Obviously, I think people wherever you live, whether you live in the United States or Canada or Mexico or France or whatever country, you don't have freedom of religion. But it brings out to me the historical importance of it. The other thing is, for Jewish people, and I suspect most of the folks here may be Jewish, Israel, being an ally to the United States, is not just for the benefit of Israel. It is for the mutual benefit of the United States. The Iron Dome technologies that they have, which is kind of like a missile defense system that Ronald Reagan talked about, is important. The 10-year military assistance is good for the United States. It's good for Israel as well. Israel is a friend in so many respects. The other aspect of our alliance with Israel is not that it is just Jewish people who think Israel ought to be a country that is protected. You can go to Liberty University. You could be with Baptists in Lynchburg, and you'll see people with U.S. and Israel flags. So when some will say, oh, the only reason the United States is supporting Israel is because of Jewish people, to me there's a tinge of, there's a wrong tinge to that. Let me just use that phrase to it, because it's not just Jewish people who care about it. So you can count on me not just being an ally alongside of each and every one of you as citizens in a free country. I have a record of working for a good relationship between the United States and Israel. Also, when I was in the Senate, we'd have hearings on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and we didn't just have one hearing, we had a follow-up hearing to make sure they knew we were paying attention to it. And this is all before I found out about our Jewish heritage and our family, and so you have me as one that you can count on to be a friend of Israel. And I love what you all are trying to do here, and that is motivate, educate, and advocate. That is, generally speaking, what we try to do in our campaign as well. Motivate and inspire people for positive, constructive ideas. And I know the focus is going to be on Israel and the Middle East, and I look forward to the discussion on a variety of issues there. But from my perspective, the greatest threat to the United States is also the greatest threat to Israel, and that is Iran getting nuclear weapons. They must be prevented from getting nuclear weapons, not contained. And moreover, Israel needs to be a free and safe country, and not in their 1967 borders, but the borders they have these days. And so I look forward to discussion. Joel, I guess I'm supposed to sit down next to you. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. He's been a senator, been a governor, but are you called governor for the rest of your life? Because isn't the governorship of Virginia the highest thing that you can actually aspire to?
I'm not one who cares much about protocol, but when you're out of office, supposedly, when you're out, you take the highest office that you served in, and governor's higher than U.S. senator. And so that's the protocol. Just call me George.
So you and I have known each other with the same college. By the way, I want to ask you this question. After it became known that you had a Jewish grandfather, did you get a call on Super Sunday? Did you get a call from the United Jewish Federation in Northern Virginia?
No. You know, boy, this sounds... no, I did not. Although,
what happens in a community with this information?
Well, the interesting thing is I had, from the Northern Virginia, we live around Mount Vernon, we have menorahs that were awards. What do you do with this to make that? I'll move it lower. Is it lower?
How did he use this one?
No, it's okay. I just moved it lower, and I think it doesn't reverberate.
Yes.
But I've gotten awards that we have, which were, with a plaque on a menorah. With it, the interesting thing, and I was mentioning it earlier, when I was able to reveal it, I was on the Senate floor, and it was going to be with Wolf Blitzer that night on CNN. And so I called Eric Cantor and Norm Coleman and Joe Lieberman, that were senators at the time, Joe still is, and all three said the same thing to me. Welcome to the tribe. Which I just got a kick out of that. That was great. And then I get on Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf Blitzer is talking about the Lombroso family barons. And I said, barons, that sounds German. How does it, what else is my mother hiding from us? And it was the baron names that were given by, there was an Italian king, and they were helpful in a plague, and so forth. And so here I am on national TV, and Wolf has these names, and I asked him for this 3x5 card, can I have this? And so while going home, Bruce and Greg, my two brothers, are emailing. They've done all this research on these Lombrosos. And I said, so I got a hold of my mother that night, and I said, this is great, Ma. I'm on national TV, and Wolf Blitzer is telling me more about your family, our family, than you've ever told me. This can be
the wonderful thing about the internet.
Yeah.
You brought up about Iran, which obviously is on the minds of a lot of the folks here. And you said I guess the United States should not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. What does that mean? What should the United States and or Israel do about that? There are sanctions in place right now, which, from what I'm reading lately the economy in Iran is in the toilet. The currency has been devalued. The president seems to be somewhat on the run. Everybody's very unhappy there. Should we allow diplomacy to continue in the sanctions, or would you advocate a much stronger, proactive military strike against those facilities?
You never take the latter off the table. And there shouldn't be any thought on the part of this theocracy that is running Iran that the United States is getting wobbly. I think there's far too much talk about stopping Israel from protecting themselves and not enough talk and concern about Iran, which is the world's largest sponsor of terror, getting nuclear weapons capabilities. The world would change so much if Iran had that. Iran is the world's largest sponsor of terror. They've been killing our troops. They've been killing our troops with IEDs. They have provided missiles to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
Do you think the United States are hungry for another war?
No. Americans are peaceful people. Americans are ones who try to believe the best in people. I'll maybe speak for myself, but I think I speak for many Americans. Americans are generally war-weary. The men and women who have served in Iraq and are serving presently in Afghanistan have been admirable in their service, as has been their families, praying for their safe return. However, Iran has been killing American soldiers with IEDs. Those IEDs could easily be nuclearized. What they get to Hezbollah to shoot into Israel, they don't necessarily, obviously they do have long-range missile capabilities, but they don't necessarily need those missiles for a delivery of a nuclear device. They could put it on something smaller. It could be as little as a suitcase bomb, so to speak, or an IED, or some of these other missiles.
Well, what do you think, if you were president on the Foreign Relations Committee, would you be telling Prime Minister Netanyahu right now he could be contemplating taking action unilaterally away from the United States, which could draw the United States into a larger conflict?
The attitude, what I'd say, and this is briefly, our president said we have your back. I say we're side by side with you. If Israel feels the need to protect their existential existence, and maybe I know that's redundant, but if they feel that, we need to be right there with them. And in fact, it is not just Israel and it's not just the United States. Other countries in the Middle East don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. I guarantee you the Saudis don't. Bahrain doesn't want them to get it. That'll give Iran an edge over them. And so we need to show that we're with them side by side, shoulder to shoulder, as opposed to saying, well, we have your back if you do it. Nor should we be publicly saying to Israel, don't attack. I just don't understand the logic of it. I think we missed a great opportunity, and I don't want to be partisan, but we missed a great opportunity when there was that spring uprising in Iran, and we stayed quiet. I remember reading about Natan Sharansky when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Natan Sharansky's in the Soviet gulag, and that gave him heart that there are people outside and other prisoners, heart that others knew what was going on. And I'm not saying we should have sent troops in, we should have at least given moral support for people who were having an indigenous uprising for a more free and just society in Iran, and we stayed quiet thinking that's going to mollify or assuage the very belligerent and dangerous activity. So I think that you need sanctions. Right now, the sanctions, there's exemptions in these sanctions. The Chinese are still getting oil out of Iran. Now, they're paying less for it because they don't have as much of a market. And the Europeans are being with us, but I think any company that is doing anything, whether it's an insurance company, a steamship line, any of those, we need sanctions that are strong sanctions and force names if they're not doing it. I think there's also clandestine, covert efforts that can be utilized, and that's all I care to say about that. I think there's way too many leaks, but ultimately if military action is necessary, it is going to be necessary because containment is not the approach. approach needs to be prevention. And by the way, this has been the policy of Democrat and Republican presidents through the years.
The United States did intervene militarily in Libya, anticipating NATO strikes, which eventually led to Gaddafi's downfall. Should the United States be doing the same thing in Syria?
In my judgment, the greatest threat of Syria is their chemical weapons stockpiles. I don't see where putting Americans at risk in Syria, as much as people may, and a lot of us don't like seeing the human tragedy of the civil war, but I'm not convinced that the United States risking lives and treasure there is going to have an outcome that's different. Syria has been a puppet regime of Iran. Snipers go in, they don't mind shooting Syrian people, whereas some of the Syrian army doesn't like shooting fellow citizens, so they bring the Iranians in who don't have any problem doing it. The biggest concern, as far as Syria is concerned, for a friend is of course Israel. And I've been to the Golan Heights and seen where Syrians had those pillboxes where they plink and down below and shoot the Israeli farmers when they're harvesting their crops. And clearly Syria's been a transport area for armaments into Lebanon, which of course has rained rockets into Israel. But the main thing is we need to secure. The place where I intervene is to secure the chemical weapons stockpiles. Not that the Assad regime is a great regime, but if that gets into the hands of any of these other terrorist organizations, that's a danger.
Do you believe there's greater limits on American power today than there ever have been? I mean, we saw the Arab Spring, which obviously Mubarak seemed to be an ally of the United States. The people rose up in revolt against him. This is happening in other countries as well. Has, in your view, you were on the Foreign Relations Committee, you were in the Senate before. How do you view the role of the United States today? Can we ever go back to the way we were in the sort of Cold War era when we were, and maybe right after, we were sort of the policemen of the world?
Yes, I do think that America can be respected throughout the world. And I think that actions that we have taken, I mentioned earlier in Iran when they had their spring revolts several years ago, we stayed quiet. They have the Arab Spring in Tunisia, and then most importantly in Egypt.
Do you think we could have kept Mubarak in power? That could have been our policy.
Well, it's hard to say what message would that say to someone who's an ally of the United States, that you jettison them. I'm not going to carry a brief for Mubarak. He's no Jeffersonian. The military relationships were pretty good with the United States. The Egyptians were helpful in counterterrorism efforts. They have a treaty, and they actually President Sadat showed great courage in that treaty with Israel. And so here you have a regime that doesn't meet necessarily all of our standards of a free and just society, but they were cooperative. They were not a threat to Israel. They had open lines through the Suez. They were not persecuting the Coptic Christians. And while not perfect, they were on our side. Now what do we have? Now we have the Muslim Brotherhood's taken over. As far as I'm concerned, they have a lot to prove whether they ought to be getting any other aid. In fact, I object to this $450 million that's being proposed to go to Egypt. I don't think a penny of our American dollars with our big deficits ought to be going to this Muslim Brotherhood when they don't even protect our embassy. So yes, I think America can be respected again, but you have to have a consistent, strong, and principled policy. Then the other thing that is affecting, I think, the view of America is that, yeah, we've had a lot of wars and we need to upgrade, we need to modernize, and here we have already over nearly $500 billion of cuts to defense, and now, because of the failure of leadership in Washington with this debt deal, which I opposed, my opponent supported it, this is going to be devastating to our military readiness, and that's the word of Secretary Panetta. And jobs here in Virginia.
Governor, a number of Republicans also supported that because it was all part of raising the debt ceiling and avoiding a financial calamity at the time. Is this sort of in a sense, 2020 hindsight, if you would have voted against it. I mean, everybody's back was against the wall, and nobody thought we actually would get to the sequestration situation that we're in. We just was, in a sense, buying time. Wasn't that a good decision to get us over that?
No. Well, that's my opponent says. We had a debate recently, and he said it was the right thing to do. At that time, we both took stands on it. We were asked about, what do you think of this deal? And I was opposed to it. I got some blasting. I said, you ought to have real spending caps. Leadership is about setting priorities and getting others to work together to achieve those goals. When I was governor, I said education and law enforcement were the top responsibilities of the state government, and with the way you paid for them, it was with a vibrant economy. At the national level, it's in the Constitution. One of the prime responsibilities of the federal government is national defense. Joel, I could never imagine myself voting for something where you're pushing off decisions to yet another commission, a super committee this time, that if they fail, half the cuts are coming from the paramount responsibility of the federal government and could jeopardize so many jobs in Virginia. That's what I said at that time. And sadly, that's exactly what's happened. Now, you say, all right, some of these folks voted for that last year. Well, in May of this year, the House of Representatives, Congressman Ridgel and Whitman and Forbes and Scott, all, I don't know how Bobby voted. But anyway, they voted in the House to avert those cuts by making cuts elsewhere. And so that they wouldn't have these devastating cuts to our military. The Senate has done nothing. Nothing. They haven't even passed a budget in 3.5 years. My general view is the members of Congress ought to have their pay withheld for not getting these appropriations done on time. And if the Senate doesn't like what the House passed, adopt your own approach and then work it out in the conference committee. But doing nothing is going to be harmful to our military readiness as well as literally hundreds of thousands of defense and technology jobs here in Virginia.
You mentioned the Senate. If you're elected and Todd Akin is elected, you'll be sitting with Todd Akin in the U.S. Senate. He is a congressman from Missouri who, if you recall, was quite a stir when he said that a woman, if she's legitimately raped, can avoid pregnancy. A number of Republicans at that time called for him to be replaced as the nominee for the Senate in Missouri, and he stayed with it. And now that he is the nominee, a number of them have come back and are now supporting him. What was your view when Akin made those statements? Do you feel he should have dropped out as the Senate candidate? And will you be comfortable? Are you comfortable with this position and serving with him in the United States Senate?
We have a bunch of different questions. As soon as I heard those remarks, somebody actually sent them to me, and I remember reading them that night and drafted a statement that evening to be released first thing in the morning, deploring his statements. And I condemned those statements, deplored them from the outset, and the thoughts behind the statements as well. The assertion of, however, legitimate
rape.
Yeah, legitimate.
A woman's body can shut down.
So wrong in so many ways. Before even being in government, I was on the rape crisis board in Charlottesville, and you learn a lot from listening. And rape is a physical assault on people. It's also a psychological, emotional one as well. And then you hear something like that, and you just. And I'm not going to bring up anybody's names because confidentiality is very important. And that's one of the other reasons why whenever there's any proposals relative to abortion, in my view, there should always be exceptions for rape, pregnancies caused by rape, incest, or the life of the mother.
So you disagree with the Republican platform in the convention, which did call for no abortions even in cases of rape or incest?
To the extent you describe or define it that way, Joel, you know me long enough. I also have my own point of view on a lot of things, and I think that that issue of abortion is best decided not by the federal government, but by the people in the states to decide the parameters of it.
Well, you would be.
But I also do feel that it all should have exceptions for rape and incest.
You would be in the U.S. Senate, though, and would be potentially confirming the next U.S. Supreme Court justice, which everybody knows is one of the most important things that should be on the minds of people voting in Senate elections as well as presidential elections. Would you vote for a nominee who was clear that he would vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, since you just discussing abortion?
Well, first of all, no one ever answers that question. No, I'm not talking about me not answering the question. I'm talking about any nominee is that you just don't ask them about cases, and if they ever do get those questions, they say it would not be appropriate to answer questions on cases that might come before the court. Here's what I would want, and whomever a nominee would be, and that is someone who understands that the role of a judge is to apply the law, not to invent the law. They're supposed to interpret the Constitution and not put in their own political views to it. Even if the case may have an unjust result, what they ought to do is blast how bad the law is, and then have the legislative representatives of the people change the laws. Cynthia Kinzer is, to me, a perfect example of what a judge should be in so many respects. I appointed Cynthia to the Supreme Court of Virginia when I was governor. She is now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Virginia, the first woman Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia. There was a case, and it had to do with liability and caps on liability, which I think is good in medical liability laws, and it's good to have caps. However, the caps were really too low and worked an injustice in a case. And what she said is this is wrong. This person should be getting more compensation because of the injuries, but it's not for us in the court to do it. It is up to the legislature to do it. And then the next year, the Virginia General Assembly went into session, and they changed the law and had a gradual increase in it. And to me, that's the way justice is supposed to be done. You need to have fair adjudication of disputes. That's, I think, one of those pillars of a free and just society where our God-given rights are protected. And so that's what I'd want to see in a judge. I don't want activist judges who ignore the Constitution and ignore the laws.
The presidential election, of course, we're having the first big debate tonight. And the issue that really seems to have driven a lot of debate here in the last few weeks flowed out of that talk that Mitt Romney made to the $50,000.
Just so you understand, when I said no one answered that question.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm talking about judges, just so you get that straight.
Okay.
No judicial nominees getting asked that question.
Anyway,
as far as I'm concerned, my view is the decisions should be made by the people of the state. All right.
The line, of course, that came out of that was about that 47% of the people are not going to vote for me. They're dependent upon government. They believe they're victims. They believe the government has a responsibility to care for them. They're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, you name it, etc. That's an entitlement. You said that you sort of cringed when Todd Aiken made his statements about rape. What was your feeling when you heard those statements that Mitt Romney made?
I was wondering how this had anything to do with Israel.
Well, now people here are not interested in...
no, I'm just having fun with you.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm looking at is folks here are very interested in social issues and entitlement issues and things like that. Budget issues as well. I have questions here about the budget committee we're asking.
Again, as I said, I have my own way of looking at things and my own point of view. And many here have heard me give speeches throughout this campaign. And I say the folks who, and I say this to Republican groups as well, I said, do not go to folks trying to persuade them to be for us based on red versus blue or Republican versus Democrats. Say, talk about our ideas and how that'll have a positive impact on their lives or their small business or their families. And I tell folks, I said, look, anybody who uses electricity ought to be on our side. Because the other side's trying to outlaw coal. You outlaw coal, you end up with a higher electricity cost. Anybody who drives a car ought to be on our side. Because first day as a U.S. Senator, I would introduce a bill to allow us in Virginia to produce oil and gas off our coast and use those royalties for roads and transportation. Anybody who thinks healthcare decisions ought to be made by doctors and patients rather than bureaucrats ought to be on our side. Because my friend Tim Kaine has said, you know, that Obamacare would be, quote, great for Democrats. Well, from my point of view, it's not great for Republicans, independents, Democrats, seniors, orthodontists, not many people, but small businesses. Anybody who pays taxes ought to be on our side. Anybody who works for a living or wants a job should be on our side because our ideas will produce more job opportunities. It's proven by our approach when I was governor and what we did working on a bipartisan basis with the Democrats in control of the legislature. And anybody who cares about the future of their children and grandchildren ought to be on our side, especially these days where about a third of graduates move back home. I was with Bruce with a business group. I remember there was a student who graduated from the University of Virginia, and he was a waiter there. And I was just thinking, you don't need to go to university. I figured, shoot, if he started out of high school, he'd be managing the place. So it's a tough job market. So that's the way I look at it. Is that, in my view, 99% of the people ought to be on our side. And as I said earlier, I believe in the best in people. And there's a lot of folks who may be down and out right now, but they want to take care of themselves. They want to take care of their families. And they want a job. And in my view, the best thing we can do in government is make sure we have the right tax, the right regulatory, right energy, and education policies to make sure this is a land of opportunity for all.
Do you believe part of this campaign is about taxes? Because I think in that last debate there was some talk about what we do with push tax cuts, and Kane had said possibly a tax increase for people making over $500,000. Are you diametrically opposed to any increase in revenue, even if it comes from removing certain loopholes? I mean, because there is a question out here as to whether we actually can bring down the deficit without revenue as well as spending cuts, as sort of the Simpson-Bowles Commission proposed.
You need both. And there's different ways of raising revenues.
Give us some, because
yeah,
that's been part of the issue.
Let me give you some examples. It's a really good question, Jill. Raising taxes in this fragile economy is not going to create any jobs. And so to the extent they're saying, oh, the only way that you're going to get a new deal is by raising taxes, is only going to put more people out of work. And I think it's absolutely wrong to use the men and women in our armed services as a political bargaining chip to raise taxes on job-creating small business owners. Now, I think we ought to have tax reform, comprehensive tax reform, which does mean eliminating loopholes or deductions and exemptions and so forth. You have companies, and we have the worst in the world tax, a 35% tax on job-creating businesses in the United States. It's worst. And the international average is 25%. Joel, I've been advocating in our Blueprint for America's Comeback, trying to motivate and educate and advocate in our campaign, 20%, because I think America should be better than average, and that in itself would create over 500,000 new jobs a year. That's 5 million jobs over a 10-year period. Now, you have some companies, you get John Deere, they're paying 33% taxes. There's some companies that are paying zero. Obviously, those that are paying zero with this new system will be paying 20% rather than zero. And so I do think there ought to be that sort of reform. The other revenue revenue gainer for the government, which seems to be ignored so much, is energy. If energy is being produced on federal lands or federal waters, the federal government gets money. When I talk about us getting royalties, we would get 37.5% of the royalties for production of oil and gas off our coast to Virginia, which I think ought to be used for roads and transportation, and the members of the General Assembly and governor can figure out what they think are the priorities. The federal government, if we unleashed our energy resources, and this is a place where it's great that we're number one. We are number one in the world in energy resources. Russia's second. It's a national security issue, but if we used our energy resources from Virginia to the Gulf, from the Appalachians to the Rockies to the barren North Slope of Alaska, there'd be hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs created. We'd have more affordable fuel and food and electricity. We wouldn't be so vulnerable to hostile outside forces. We'd be keeping our money here in the United States of America, and the federal government could get over $1 trillion of revenues without raising taxes. So why not do this?
Do you have an environment, because obviously there are people down in this part of the state who have some concerns about drilling offshore because of environmental reasons. Do you see there's a legitimate environmental concern? And also the Navy has some concerns too about putting oil wells out in the Atlantic Ocean. How do you view those
concerns?
As far as the environment's concerned, I do share that concern, and I think that the most technologically advanced approaches and mechanisms and safeguards need to be put in place. What happened in the Gulf of Mexico was a terrible catastrophe. I remember after Hurricane Katrina and all those storms, Rita came through, there wasn't any significant environmental damage. They shut them all down, but that was a mistake. And from that, in the Gulf area, they have added precautions, and I want us to use the best in the world off our coast and off any coast in the world, but particularly here in Virginia and America. As far as a platform being out there, I think the Navy can get around a platform. There's container ships coming in all the time that have a great height, and that is, in fact, the Navy, whether it's ships or whether it's aircraft, I think that they operate in places where there's oil platforms and harbors where there are container ships coming in.
A number of Republicans, and I think that Romney too, has said that he would veto or somehow get rid of the Affordable Care Act on his first day in office. Are you ready to get rid of what's called Obamacare lock, stock, and barrel, or would you look to amend it? How is your view of that policy?
Good question, and this is another big difference between Tim and myself. Tim has stated, and I think I mentioned it, he says that he thought that this Affordable Care Act was, quote, great for Democrats. I've heard from so many people, small businesses who don't want to get over 50 employees. Heard from a business just last week, they have 325 employees with a kind of a home healthcare, home assistance business, and he says, if we have to provide this health insurance, I'm going to have to lay off, I'm going to go out of business, and that's 325 jobs. And I asked him, I said, well, could you just pay that tax, that $2,000 fine? He says, I don't make enough money on these folks to pay that. So they just would go out of business, and people wouldn't have the benefit of that service. There are seniors who are worried legitimately, because I've heard from doctors who don't want to take any more Medicare patients. I mentioned orthodontists, they're limiting the flexible savings accounts to $2,500. Many people, including our family, use either health savings accounts or flex savings accounts for our children getting braces. There's even a worry about whether the medical device tax, it's a gross revenues tax of 2.3%, would apply to braces in addition to wheelchairs and stents. And so there's so many taxes and so many wrong things about this that harm our economy and jobs and access to health care. I think health care decisions ought to be made by doctors and patients. So contrary to Tim thinking it's, quote, a great achievement as well, I would want to be the deciding vote to repeal and replace it. There is a provision that I would want to keep in it, and that is allowing children to stay on their parents' policies until age 26. I was mentioning earlier how terrible the job market is for young people right now. And even if they do get a job, a lot of young folks don't have an employer that's providing health insurance, so it's better that they're covered by someone than no one. Here are the positive things that ought to be done. Number one, we ought to be promoting health savings accounts, which are personal, they're more affordable, they're portable. People can take that insurance, they own it from job to job, and not have to worry about being pre-existing conditions being excluded in a new company that they go to. And I'm not like Congress saying, oh, this is one thing that we have for the federal government and then you all have a different one in waivers. And I, by the way, think that whatever laws Congress imposes on us ought to apply to them as well. So health savings accounts is something that I know can work, and we use it in our own family, my own small business. Secondly, small businesses ought to be able to band together across state lines into larger risk pools. And so you get businesses here in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Maryland, Delaware, maybe all banding together. You get more competition, more choice, and more affordable health care. The other thing is on Medicaid, and it's similar to what we did when I was governor on welfare reform, and that is I look at the states as laboratories of innovation. And the states have half the money going into state taxpayers pay for half of Medicaid, federal taxpayers the other half. But I think the states ought to be given greater flexibility to manage and run the Medicaid program. I think they do it much more efficiently with greater accountability.
But you didn't like it when you were governor. The federal government said, "No, we're just going to cut your money," because obviously a lot of this care is nursing home care. I'm sure I have people here, and I know I have JFS people out here. We go to Richmond every year, talk to the state, we go to Washington, talk to the federal government, making sure that these vulnerable people are protected and Medicaid is not chopped when the costs of care keep going up.
Exactly. And I think it can be done much more efficiently by the state. Jill, thank you for adding that to it. There's one other good idea that I think makes sense, and that is you're talking about long-term care. So many of us at some point may need long-term care, assisted living. What happens in far too many cases is folks lose their homes, they lose all their assets, they spend down, so to speak, and then they go on Medicaid. I think a really good idea would be to allow people to use funds in their 401k or their IRA to get long-term care insurance. And it's for retirement age, and to me that would be a good way of promoting personal responsibility so that folks wouldn't be losing their homes and their assets. So
this event is sponsored by the Freedom Agency.
If there's somebody out here who sells it, good. No, but the point is, that's kind of a common sense, logical, new idea.
One of the great challenges out in this country right now, we've gone through the mortgage, and we're still probably in the challenge of mortgages, and a lot of loans rates are still going to go up more. We may be seeing more foreclosures going forward. We're really seeing with college loans that a lot of kids went through college with loans. They now have to pay back, and they don't have the jobs to pay them back. And it's a great crisis that's happening. And part of the reason that some have said is that the federal government was putting so much money out there for these grants and loans that more and more people are going to college, more and more are getting into debt. Should the federal government be more circumspect about the amount of money it's putting into college loans? I know everybody would like their child to go to college. Not everybody can afford it, put the money away, but we're maybe setting people up for long-term debt issues because of these college loans. How would Israelis do that?
I don't know. So I'm sure they'd be very efficient.
Yeah.
They have to be. And intense about it.
Is the federal government spending too much money and trying to send too many people to college?
Well, it's really, that's a decision for the individual. I'm not one who likes to have the government deciding, what people do in their lives. I know when I was governor, we made this a priority. And tuition was frozen. First, we limited it to the rate of inflation, then froze college tuition while I was governor at community colleges and universities, and also increased the tuition assistance grants for those going to independent colleges. And that saved families, on average, about $4,400 over that period of time. And what that required was more funding for higher ed so that they didn't have to get the money out of the parents or the students in tuition. Now, that's a different approach than my friend Tim Kaine had, because tuition soared over 30% during his 4 years. The other thing we created was the prepaid college tuition plan, where people can lock in today's rates. And this has been very helpful, not just for parents. Grandparents will get this prepaid college tuition. And we started that when I was governor. Florida was the lead in it. Diana Cantor was our first executive director of it. And so to me, that's a way of making college more affordable. Some of the good things that have been going on through the years is folks will take the first 2 years in community colleges, which are you talk about efficient higher education that is focused on the needs of a community. Community colleges are a bargain. The other thing is not everyone necessarily needs to go to college to get a good job. There is a tremendous demand for welders, for example, trades, which are maybe a year or 2 years of training, and those technicians are really important. You also have the value, and I was at ECPI, for example, here in this area, and there's a lot of folks leaving the military they're not getting an education for the social experience of it. They want to get the training, they want the education, they want to get on a job, they want to be productive. So I think it should be, the decision should be made by individuals, and I think it's important for guidance counselors or employment counselors to say, well, here are the jobs, here's where the demands are, here's where you can provide for yourself if you have that inclination.
Last question. The voters of Virginia, in a sense, told you in 2006, George Allen, we don't want you to be our senator anymore, but you're asking them to put you back in 2012. Why do you think they want to? Why do you think you should be the senator again 6 years after that referendum on your service?
Thanks for the kind question.
Never promised you a rose garden.
No, I didn't expect it. I only expect thorns from you. One of the things that I learned from sports and learned from my father is you get knocked down, you get back up. My father had a quote, "Don't brood over your mistakes, learn from them and improve." And that's what I have aimed to do. I didn't know I'd get back into it. In some respects, and people were asking me to run for governor. And I gave a speech at the Fredericksburg Christian Schools in 2007. And they didn't want to hear a speech on policy or politics. They wanted to say what it was like growing up in a football family.
That was going to be my next question.
Well, some of you have heard me say the 4 F's were important in our family: faith, family, freedom, and football. Not necessarily in that order. But family is the most important thing. It's where you learn right from wrong, the importance of faith, honesty, diligence. And there are so many things that I was able to, at any rate, in thinking of running, I said, all right, you don't just run in 2009, notwithstanding how many people want you to run, is that you would start right away in 2008 and want to make a decision at the end of that year. And I actually thought I would practice what I've just preached, that family's the most important thing. And so I've been able to do things with Susan I never would have been able to do if I were serving the people or running for office, and things that will be memories for the rest of our lives with our kids, with all three, with Tyler, with Forrest, driving cross country, all sorts of events with our youngest daughter, Brooke. And I'm really glad I did it. And I've also had to start over again in many respects. And I wrote a book, writing a book on what the world, what Washington can learn from the world of sports was really growing up. Susan said, reflections on growing up. And Susan said it was very good that it reminded me how important my parents were in my life. And I was involved with the Young America's Foundation, which entails speaking Reagan Ranch Presidential Scholar, which entails going on college campuses and speaking to college kids, which was about the age I was when I was at the University of Virginia when Ronald Reagan had asked me to head up Young Virginians for Reagan. And the only reason I knew Ronald Reagan is when we moved out to California, Reagan got elected governor and would come to the LA Rams practices. And I thought, a kid growing up in football, gee, here's a politician who knows what's important, football. And he'd come to practices. The politicians all go to the games, but he would go and study at practice. And at any rate, these young people are the same age as I was, and way ahead of where I was when I was in college, as far as knowledge of government and so forth. And at any rate, I was helping candidates out, whether it's Scott Ridgell or others, and Bob McDonnell, who's a really good longtime friend. And I saw this as a time that is a very important time in our country in the course of America's history. And so while people are always telling folks to run for office, it's not easy. It's tough on the family. And the home precinct mattered a lot. And if Susan wasn't for it, I wouldn't be doing it. And Susan's clearly the most valuable player of our team, and she's campaigning elsewhere while I'm here getting your wonderful questions. And at any rate, being outside, you can reflect. Watching what goes on in the Senate. When I got elected to the Senate previously, I didn't know how the Senate really operated.
That's why I'm surprised you're going back.
Well, and it was frustrating for people who like to see things getting done. It really is. But you saw that this health care tax law passed by one vote. They failed to rein in EPA by one vote. Every vote matters. And I felt that the people who were encouraging me to run, that I could offer ideas that are proven approaches to get this country going in the right direction again. And I just really do want to see America reaching its full potential, not for America, but for the American people. And the thing that really got me, Joel, was our daughter Tyler, all the happiness, graduating from JMU, moves back home because she didn't have a job. it's not unique to us. She's lucky she eventually found work. But you see her friends, her peers, and that's the same thing. And then I read in the Washington Post an article where a guy said, well, these young people, their expectations are too high. And I thought, my goodness, this is America. In America, you should only be limited by your imagination, your ingenuity, and your hard work. And that is as much a motivation in this election as not for most of us or for people of my age. It is really for younger people, those who are in college right now or high school, and their future. And so that's why Susan and I are offering ourselves not as ideas, but conduits for the voices of Virginians that are seemingly ignored. And again, watching what they're doing in Washington and knowing how it operates, you say, my goodness, these folks are so out of touch with reality. They are not listening to the voices, the hopes, the aspirations of the people of Virginia. And so that's why I got off the sidelines and into the fight, and ultimately we're going to work as hard as we can, and it'll be decided by the people of Virginia. But I do think that anybody, November 6th, but I do think if any of y'all use electricity, drive a car, think healthcare decisions ought to be made by you and your doctor, if you pay taxes, if you work for a living or want to get a job, or if you care about the future of your children and grandchildren, I would respectfully ask for your vote. Thank you.
I admire anybody that runs for office, particularly statewide office, and this is probably the fourth time you've done it, right? As governor and two Senate races. And,
I didn't get into this without knowing what I'm
getting into. So I admire you. I will say he was one of the most consequential governors in the history of Virginia. Certainly brought a lot of change up in Richmond, and so you come to this with a lot of credentials. And speaking on behalf of everybody here, we're very pleased. One, that you're running, and two, that you decided to come and listen to our questions today. I thank you very much. He and I are old friends and been around the block, so it's great. Thank you. Now, by the way, Tim Kaine will be here next Friday. We'll go through the same things, similar questions. We'll challenge Tim Kaine as well. And then we're going to have a congressional debate with Paul Hirschfield and Scott Bridgel on October the 25th that evening. So please come back for all of that. I want to acknowledge Wally Erb, who's running for mayor of Virginia Beach, who's here. Patrick Salyers, who's very active in politics here in Hampton Roads. And we got Brian Naylor's here from NPR, which I'm happy to have him here as well. Bill Seifel from the Pilot, thank you for covering this. Any other people running for office who I've missed? Leonard Tango, who's running for school board in Virginia Beach. And anyone else? Listen, thank you all very much. Thank you.